We're going to gather together. Hello. Wow, quite a lot of people. Thank you so much for coming and giving up your Tuesday afternoon to sit and have this conversation with us. My name is David. I'm Artistic Director here at the Royal Court. And we'd really like to thank Genesis Foundation for supporting this conversation. This is a conversation I've been wanting to have for about a year since I started in this role. We're living in a time of really extreme polarisation, and I think that is likely only to get worse as the year progresses and as my time here as Artistic Director progresses. That polarisation manifests across almost every line a theatre runs across. I think we are increasingly divided across social lines, across political lines. We are increasingly divided across global and sort of socio-global sort of forces, which we are seeing increasingly out in America. We're seeing increasing growth through Europe. And theatres and cultural organisations sit at the absolute nexus of that pressure. And yet it feels like we're not really talking about it. And it feels like increasingly institutions and artists are having almost entirely different conversations. And sometimes the institutions are being silent on issues that matter so much in the wider society and to artists. So this conversation, I suppose, is the beginning of us, as the Royal Court, starting to talk about how we might work better together to overcome some of those issues and how we might work better in a time when actually artists and institutions need to be working more in concert than ever before. I don't have the answers for this. It's part of the reason we're starting this conversation. We're having other events and talks around this subject. We've got a Playwrights Assembly happening in a few weeks' time, where playwrights will come together in this building and we'll talk about what we might do to rebuild some of the trust that feels like it's been lost since lockdowns, particularly around these issues. While I don't have the answers, what I'm sure of is that lack of dialogue is causing an increasing rift. And as we try and work out those imbalances, we know there are no easy answers. So I'm particularly grateful for the panel today, who are coming at this topic from lots of different perspectives, for braving it, sticking your head across the parapet, and coming to open a dialogue with us today. What we're going to do is we're going to talk for about 45 minutes. We're then going to have room for some questions from the audience that you can question the panel on the discussion that we've had. We can then move into the bar, where there'll be an opportunity to talk further. There'll be other events that we'll be hosting, and there'll be a chance to write in what your conclusions and what your thoughts are post this discussion. But first, I'm going to introduce the panellists who have braved to come and talk to us this afternoon. So in alphabetical order, we have Mark Borkowski, famous for being the publicist at Stratford East during the time it was possibly one of the UK's most politicised theatres, is now a crisis PR guru specialising in reputational risk. We have Lilli Geissendorfer, who is probably the ultimate multi-hyphenate. Lilli is a theatre producer who's prominently held roles at various funding bodies, including being the director of Jerwood Arts. You previously worked at Arts Council England. You're currently director of Theatre Green Book. You're on several boards. You come at this from multiple angles. We've got Katie Posner, who is a theatre director and co-artistic director at Plough, one of the most significant new writing organisations in the UK, taking Playwrights' work to audiences across the country. We've got Devyani Saltzman, who is a writer and curator, currently Director of Arts at the Barbican. This year, her new book is being published, Exiting, which explores where institutions and diverse leadership clash and what healthier systems might look like. And finally, we've got Nina Segal. Nina is a playwright whose work has always had a social and political dimension, and you're currently Associate Director here at the Royal Court. But first, I thought I would start by asking the audience some questions, just to see where we are in the room, with a show of hands. So I'm going to read some statements, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you agree with this statement. Should artists have complete freedom to express controversial and political views in their work? Have a show of hands if you agree with this. Can we have a show of hands if you disagree with that statement? Okay. Is self-censorship by artists or institutions ever justified in the sake of audience comfort? Can we have a show of hands if you agree with that? And can we have a show of hands if you disagree that self-censorship by artists is ever justified for the sake of audience comfort? Okay. Is self-censorship by artists or institutions ever justified for the sake of the safety of an artist? Show of hands if you agree with this statement. Slightly more dissonance. And a show of hands if you disagree with that statement. And is the censorship of artists or institutions ever justified in the sake of a broader organisational or artistic mission? Show of hands if you agree. We've almost reached it, and a show of hands if you disagree. Wonderful. Final question. Should institutions be held accountable for the political views expressed in the work that they programme? A show of hands if you agree. And should institutions be held accountable? Sorry, let me rephrase it to a yes or no. Institutions should be held accountable for the political views that they express in the work that they programme. Do you agree? Or do you disagree? Interesting. Yeah. So I'm going to start with Mark. So, Mark, everybody on this panel has been warned against reputational risk when expressing political or social views around sort of discourse they might wade into. Are we genuinely at risk in the current society, and was it always like this? Ultimately, is this panel a terrible idea?
Look, I'm looking around, and I can see lots of faces here, and as I'm the token boomer on the stage, and I'm possibly, I would think, the oldest person in the building, which is pretty spooky to me. Yes, everyone is at risk. And that is really stems from the fact that I was given an amazing opportunity by an extraordinary theatre producer, director, Philip Headley, who took a risk on me, which I'm forever grateful for. And when back in the 80s, it was de rigueur, as would happen with this building through Max Stafford Clark, to bite the hand that fed you. Just because you were getting a fat subsidy from the Arts Council, that didn't mean that they were safe from criticism. And if there was any doubt levelled against your programme, Philip would actually. And of course, it was right in the heart of Thatcher, where you had a lot of baying politicians who thought the idea of arts subsidy was an appalling idea, and particularly if the work was highly critical of the government. So it was a double-edged sword to not only attack the funder, but also attack the government. And of course, at the time, it was, you would look and hope for a Tory MP, preferably from Essex or Kent, to actually level a voice, hopefully in Parliament, about what you were staging. And of course, that drew huge attention and audiences would come. But make no doubt that the work was good, and it was strong and it was provocative. I think things have fundamentally changed, and as I reference the fact of my age and my vintage and whatever, it's unrecognisable now to the conditions that existed in the 1980s, and to some extent, many people in this room weren't even born at that time. So it's strange for me to be part historian and archivist of a memory, which perhaps isn't all true as we go through memory. But it was vibrant, it was a community, and we were not dominated primarily by social media. And the titans of Silicon Valley and the growth of what is a very self-centered, narcissistic society where people need their own channels, perhaps to exist as an artist, to create work, to take control of their channels. So everything's become incredibly polarized. And, of course, therefore, the conditions are different. So those conditions are governed by a certain amount of fear. The Arts Council did a remarkable job in the sort of 90s where they restructured. Timidity came in because if you did gradually bite the hand that fed you, you'd lose your grant. And that was very reminiscent now of the council culture was going on. You had to comply. There was a corporatization. There was more, you had to, and it always used to frustrate me, we had to sort of speak of the value as if we were a business, if we were a brand, the value of art, where to me it was given by the audience and the work and its impact. We're seeing now a different age where the crimes of the past, you know, are coming back to haunt people, justifiably so in many occasions, but there doesn't seem to be empathy. I think we talked about it just before this panel, and I think empathy is not there. There is a certain degree of non-forgiveness. If you've made a mistake, that's it. And there's no arena to deal with people exchanging views and values on that cancel culture. So we then spread this fear of supporting anybody who's down, even if you believe it's right. It's fine to call someone up and say, oh, it's terrible what's happening to you and whatever. Will you speak on my behalf? Oh, no, I can't. And I can't name who, but just before Christmas, I had to defend someone who lost a number of positions that existed because he liked a tweet, a very controversial tweet. He liked it, and that created a huge surge around him where everybody ran for cover. Now, if that's not an ability to express yourself and being involved with a debate, and I think we've lost that debate. We've lost
what sort of tweets?
It was related. It was a political tweet related to obviously the conflict that's going on now in Palestine, and he took a position on that. And of course, there's some very well-tooled mechanisms to attack a person, you know, with bots, which is frightening. So technology has taken over. I think if we look at not only the lack of empathy, but the economy of hate, that you know, you're going to get more channeling if you dislike something or get into it. So there's no even-handedness in what I see at the moment, and I think that's the danger. And things can grow, and you need incredible strength. You need strength of character to be, and a strong sense of belief, and an absolute belief in yourself and your work to keep going against a lot of things that will be pulled apart, particularly funding, particularly support. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a sort of...
Nina, as a playwright, how much do you recognise of this? Have you ever been nervous around the stuff, around the work that you've been writing or staging?
Yeah, I think every writer feels nervous about their work for all kinds of reasons. I think for me specifically, there was a project that I did at the New Diorama with you when you were still there, called War and Culture, which, because it's a play that I started writing in 2017, and then it's a play that didn't go on, went on in a slightly different guise in 2022, it feels really possible for me to like track a change in myself and how I related to it and the kind of fear that I felt around it across those 5 years. It's a show called War and Culture. It centres on a theatre that, due to something that occurs on one of its stages, there's a protest outside that kind of grows and grows and grows and spirals. When I first started writing it in 2017, I started writing it on a sort of research theatre trip to Poland, and I started writing it in a context where I felt like this question of censorship in theatre was very, was very theoretical and was something that was interesting but was happening in other countries. By the time we came to actually stage that show in 2022, it felt so much closer. The other big thing that changed for me was I remember writing that show in 2017. At the time, it had a different title. It was called The National, which kind of speaks to like, it was talking about theatre, and it was a theatre show that was the only potential criticism or provocation that I was aware of was from theatre. Like it felt, at least in my experience at that time, like it was a much more closed world that theatre people were speaking to theatre people. By the time I got to 2022, I had seen enough other artists, enough of my peers get pulled through that like culture wars ringer that it felt naive at that point to say we're only talking theatre artist to theatre artist. I felt like I understood all the reasons for the very same reasons for programming that show at that time, which was a heightened environment of censorship, increasing dissolution of the idea that the Arts Council was at arm's length from our previous government. Those were all the reasons to program it, and those were the same reasons why once David came to me and said, hey, let's do this show, I felt really afraid. There were also like contextual personal reasons as well. I was extremely busy and I was extremely pregnant, and I didn't, the possibility of getting churned up in a Daily Mail article didn't seem like something I wanted to take on at that time. And actually the outcome of it, which was really, really positive, was I spoke to David and Will, who's the exec here, who was the exec at New Diorama, and said, look, these are the reasons I feel afraid of this show and I want to do this show, but this is the fear that I'm feeling. And we found a version of staging that show that felt more supportive. We put the show on, it was on public sale, we didn't press it, and it just took out that level of the possibility of people responding to an idea of a show that they half heard about in a review that sort of didn't really get it or had its own agenda about it, and said, okay, this show is only going to be engaged with by people who are actually in the room seeing it. And that felt a lot more productive, and really, for me as a theatre artist, I feel like you spend the majority of my experience has been going into buildings and being more willing to take risk than the building, and actually having the inverse of that, and a theatre building saying, we want to take the risk, but if you don't feel like that is right in this moment, we're going to support you to make this feel less risky. Felt like a real opportunity to build trust. And I think that trust is such an important part of this conversation. How do we regain the trust between artists and institutions, and between playwrights and buildings? Because obviously that situation really helped me trust David, which was a large part then of like me ending up in this position here. But I think we need to work out a way that can't all be about one artist and one show and one experience. We've got to find a way to like roll out the trust.
Can I ask Katie, as an artistic director, when the last time you programmed something that you were nervous about around these themes, and like where that fear came from and what you did?
I think I guess as a national company, we always start from a place of like, what's a national conversation, and how we platforming national voices, because we take plays all across the country. We don't have the autonomy to say, oh, and that play is definitely going to be performed, that plays are going to be performed in that building. Like, we have to approach co-producers. So we sort of start from a place of that we've got to go on the hustle in the same way the playwrights do. So I guess where we sort of sit with that sense of going, I don't think we've ever sort of gone, oh, there's something that we're frightened of programming. I think we just constantly sit at that space of going, what's the rigor of the why? Like, what does it mean to tell this story and why? And who gets to tell this story and why? And really recognising our position as gatekeepers and what that means. And I guess where that sort of sits in that sort of global picture of going, oh, when something comes in that you go, actually, this is a really juicy, knotty play. Maybe that's something that we, have to grapple with. Maybe that is going to push, contentious conversations on stage, but we know that there's a reason and there's a backing and we know the why, and we're sat there going, right, okay, so what have we got to put in place? An example of that was the winner of the Women's Prize, fantastic playwright, wrote an amazing play about Egypt, but wrote that under a pseudonym name. And we were like, right, how do we protect that writer? How is that play going on its journey where it criticises a state that is a police state? There is big political, knotty conversations. but my gosh, that play is amazing, and like, what we're going to do and what's the foundation. So I guess we sort of hold all of those thoughts. We don't get it right all the time, and we never sit there and pat ourselves on the back and go, aren't we great? Like, we're always questioning ourselves. I mean, that is the best bit about having a dual artistic director, CEO of a company. Like, we're constantly playing devil's advocate. We have these big conversations as a team. And I think what you're saying, which I find so fascinating, is we are at a point of like going, actually, where will it get to a point? And it will. Where will it get to a point where we go, actually, are we afraid of that play? And why? And what would that mean for us? And I think exactly as you're saying, it's become so monolith, it's become so binary, the thinking. And I go, well, isn't that the whole point of stories, of like great characters on stage, all different versions of people? There's some amazing playwrights, like what we're doing.
Mark, you talked about, I suppose, funding and how more fickle that might have come over the years. So I suppose, Lilli, jumping in with like a really critical question, thinking back to your time working as a funder, would you ever have not funded a piece of work explicitly because of its politics? And how would you even begin to make that sort of decision?
I really want to respond to Katie before I answer your question. And everything that you've just been saying, really, because I think this question of what's changed, and hearing your perspective from, eons ago, the 90s.
80s.
I do remember some of that, but anyway. But I was thinking about a show I produced in 2008 called Monsters, which was about Jamie Bulger's Killers by a Swedish writer called Nicholas Radstrom, and I produced it at the Arcola Theatre. And it was contentious then. It drew the Daily Mail, it drew significant consternation. But I was just thinking, which plays are we not seeing now? What is the list of stories that are not being told today? And I was thinking, could I produce that today? Which theatre would put that on? And I was just trying to think, I don't think I would have the guts anymore, because the technological changes and the kind of spirit of where we're at now, the lack of empathy, the lack of trust, has eroded to the point where I wouldn't feel safe as the producer of that work today. But I did, gosh, a very long time ago.
Well, that's sad. That's my point. That's incredibly sad.
Yeah.
And I think, we are creatures of emotion. And the digital space allows us to vent that emotion. And I think the technological gods who gather around Trump at his inauguration understand that. And we live in a post-fact world, that's true. I mean, we're dominated by ridiculous conspiracy theories. And so for all those add to those conditions that fit it. But if you look at something and it is factually incorrect, I have been involved with situations where the crowd's emotion, or what they choose to believe, by the channels they've received information, those silos, will dismiss any logic and reduce it to an emotional space that then fuels a tide, of argument. And I think that there's, the mainstream media, the age of legacy media is just so far away from us now. And I think we all have to be conscious about how we receive things, how we are quick to rise to judgment, because that judgment can destroy someone, I've seen it. When someone is in the center of one of those horrendous media storms, that the effect not only on, obviously, their mental health, but their entire nexus of contacts, in particular a family group, it chews everybody up. And I think when you've been inside of that, maybe you have a different view of how you'll decide to join in to a pylon. And I don't see that changing. I see that getting worse, and therefore those conditions for an artist to exist in. I mean, I took part in a conference in Amsterdam in 1999, and I look back at it now and I thought, my goodness, there was something about the Dutch in their understanding of the future, some of those ideas expressed there were really quite extraordinary. Now, I looked at the documentation around it and thought, this was predictive. I mean, there were some amazing thinkers at that place. And I'm thinking about, they've all gone. They've all gone. And the conditions that created those people, particularly theatre makers and artists, performance artists, you know, I was lucky to represent London International Festival of Theatre. It still exists now. It's still incredibly good. But for the 10 years I represented it, I went to some of the most extraordinary places and saw some extraordinary art, extraordinary festivals. And they don't exist in those places any longer. So there isn't that breeding ground, there isn't that developing ground for that type of physical theatre, performative theatre. So it's not just here. But I was lucky enough, and I know how blessed I am, you know, that I had that experience, and I built up this nexus of incredible people that forged my own way of thinking, and it had a global perspective. But that doesn't exist now. It does exist in a certain form.
Drag Lilli back to that fundamental question around funding, just quickly. So as a funder, Lilli, were you ever, I know you're very iron-stomached, but were you ever nervous around funding work because of its political content? And what sort of framework did you put around that sort of decision-making?
So the short answer is no, we didn't, I don't think, and my memory is this is going back a little while, ever not fund a project because of its political views. Yes, I was often nervous because the political questions, the big questions that the artist was asking. For context, almost all of Jerwood Arts funding went to early career artists and was sort of more seed funding, project funding. So they were always asking big questions. Made us nervous, certainly. I guess the framework, so why I say not really, is that first artistic judgment came first, and that is its own kind of kettle of fish. But in terms of trying to understand the risk around the project, we would look at fundamental human rights, really. And there's a framework that I was introduced to by an organisation called Different Angles, I think. And they taught me about the trapezium, which is basically your four freedoms. You've got your freedom of speech up here, and then your freedom from harm, and they're protected by laws and statutes, and they can be very absolutist or more relative. And then intention, and ideally some sort of balance, you've got your freedom of artistic expression and freedom to protest, and those are also protected. And of course there's sort of very legal ways of looking at this, but I will never forget John, the trainer, kind of holding his hands up, and he'd say, you know, your trapezium is a four-sided rectangle, and you can weight these four freedoms in different ways depending on your values as an organisation. And so it can pull you more towards the freedom of speech and, you know, or freedom from harm. And you try in every sort of situation to see whether you can get the balance right for that particular context, that particular situation. Of course, it's all on a spectrum, freedom from harm. Are we talking physical harm, spiritual, emotional? It's very personal. So it's never straightforward. But I think at Jerwood, the question we would most often ask ourselves was about harm, because that was where we could make a more informed judgment. So we interpreted that around, think of a funding application. Is this project fully funded? Have they got enough resources? Are they asking for enough support to support and pay everybody involved? They're not self-exploiting or exploiting anybody involved. Really basic things like that, and then moving through to, have they got the lived experience, the learned experience, the expertise to do this project in a way that is going to be just and fair and a good experience, that we can kind of, from where we're sitting now, make that assumption in good faith. So sometimes we'd have projects that didn't fulfill those kinds of criteria, and we wouldn't fund them, even though they might be quite an interesting starting point.
Devyani, I mean, we do a very similar job, and I suppose it's our job to keep this balance, and often we end up being the people trying to keep the equilibrium between the institutions and artists and more wider sort of public stakeholders. I mean, can you talk about the last year and what that's been like, I suppose, holding these conversations as we head into a time that feels more polarised than ever before, and talk me through what that looks like for you at the Barbican?
I can talk about the last 7 months because I moved from Toronto 7 months ago and have been in post, and definitely the role of kind of overseeing artistic program with myself, the rest of the leadership team, all our curators and programmers and heads of departments. But it is a real physical tension in the body. And for 3 years before this, I was an independent writer and curator outside of institutional space. And coming in, I think especially for maybe racialized, mixed race, indigenous arts leaders, which is a very live conversation in North America, the feel of responsibility to communities and artists and holding them in a place of safety, but also being in systems that were maybe not necessarily set up for you or set up in a more corporate or mechanized model. I think people feel a lot of pain, to be very honest, in those spaces. A lot of it is the trapezium. It's interesting to hear. I feel a lot of the roles about ethics now and risk assessment and constant, probably on a monthly basis, kind of sitting around a table and hashing out either a piece or potential audience response, the ability to hold it safely for the artist, different communities maybe literally warring agendas around it. And I don't know if I have any specific insight. I think we're just trying to be more nuanced and better at this is what specifically interests me, how do you not have kind of the institutional non-human wall that keeps us separate from the people we're serving, especially if we're publicly funded or have a responsibility to our communities. So getting away from the statements, getting away from the website responses, having more room for discourses like this is essential. But in short, I think it burns out individuals, and it burns out younger staff members, it burns out racialized folks, and they exit the industry. And so I think we need to find that empathy to be able to hold space and not have that happen.
I mean, we have an audience, I imagine, mostly of artists and playwrights. I mean, Mark, we've heard a bit about the risks, but when things do start to get out of control, when things do sort of leave the sphere of social media that we're comfortable with, when issues sort of start growing in a way we hadn't expected to, what are the common mistakes that people are making, and how can they avoid making those mistakes?
I think it's awareness. I think one has to kill hubris. One has to get out of those silos that I've talked about, that we are served in, sense check other views that might be alien to you. I remember we were doing a play at Stratford-East at the time of the Falklands War, and it was called No End of Blame, and it was about a bunch of kids who were forced to fight the Falklands War. And we were all very sort of fairly left-wing, and we were very, we saw this as an imperialistic sort of thrust from Thatcher, and we used to call it the Malvinas. And I remember I was in a pub in the East End playing a game of pool with my then stage manager, and I made a remark like, "This is at Malvinas." And this guy came up to me, it was before tattoos, and body art, and he just belted me. And he said, "My brother's fighting for you, mate." And I just thought about it. I thought, what an idiotic person you are to go in with those sort of views in what was a predominantly sort of hard-end working class. So you've got to get out of those silos. You've got to really question yourself and not listen to the voices that you want to hear. And that might sound simplistic, but it's quite tough, particularly if you have developed your craft, developed your thing with supporters within it. We are in those sort of silos. And then I think everybody needs to really be conscious of their shield, whether it's an organization, whether it's individual. Who is your superpower? Who are the people who are going to stand by you, who understand you, and who are going to be your critical friends? And I think that you can't exist in the artist world without that force field now, particularly in organisations. You've got to have an incredibly strong board. When people are living off sort of funding and also commercial arrangements, perhaps with sponsors and whatever, they're the first to go. They're the first to disappear. And what point do you make about something like Bailey Gifford, or some of the sort of big oil giants at the moment? It's very, very minery. But I think it's questioning yourself and actually giving that space. And again, we talked beforehand about the speed of how things happen. So therefore, how you buy time to have that centre to think about things is really important and difficult to achieve, particularly if you're living from your craft.
Because I suppose, I mean, the easy thing to do when you talk about reputational damage is to say or do nothing. But obviously, as artists and arts organisations, it's not our job not to cause trouble. I mean, Nina, do you want to talk a bit about, as a playwright over the last few years, as there has been a widely perceived silence from arts organisations around political issues, what that's felt like?
I think, I mean, I'm primarily a freelance playwright. I work here 1 day a week. Prior to that, I hadn't been inside an institution for a while, so I think I've moved from that space of being outside of an organisation, feeling like, well, it's just easy, like just solve it, just say it, to coming in and going, oh, okay, no, this is complex, but I think that the complexity of it can sometimes be a shield for organisations. I think that me personally, and this is speaking totally personally, I don't ascribe to the idea, and I push back quite strongly against the idea that our politics are only what we will make statements about on social media. I mean, I think there's like 2 or 3 platforms that are run by some of the worst people in the world, and somehow they've convinced us that if we don't say it on their platform that they make money from, we don't believe it at all. So I personally refute the idea that my moral core has to align with my Twitter feed. They're different things. I try to extend that same feeling to institutions. I also think, I feel like for a lot of us, we have the sort of knee-jerk reaction of needing to follow a social media trend or needing to make a statement has been devalued, both by the fact that it often feels like some of the bodies that put the least thought into it, it's the easiest for them to make a statement. What does it ultimately mean if Papa John's is making a statement about pride? It doesn't mean anything. It's totally devalued. But I also, on a more serious level, I also think that we have all chosen as writers, as makers, this particular form. And this is not a form of instant, this is not improv, this is not a live response form. We've chosen to make work in a way that requires some thought and some time and some craft. So that all said, I don't have an expectation, or I don't think I have as strong an expectation as some artists of why isn't this theatre making a statement on Instagram about this global conflict. I also think that that cannot be a shield forever. I think that there is a lag between an event happens in the world and the theatre responding to it, just because of the time that it takes to make work and to formulate thoughts and turn those into productions, but I think that can't be that long. Because I think the main risk is that if the theatre's job for me is to interrogate the world. And I think that if a theatre is scared to even acknowledge what is going on in the world, then it becomes irrelevant. And so I think for theatres, that's got to be the thing. It's if you can't just coast along, never saying what is going on in the world, because then you'll just stop saying anything of meaning, and then we're just a sort of after-dinner entertainment.
Katie, can I ask you, where do you stand then on, I suppose, new writing institutions ourselves having political views as companies?
I was just thinking of what you were saying, and my brain went immediately to the Titanic analogy, where they're playing the violins and the ship's sinking, and everyone's going to die. And it is, sometimes it feels like that. And as a theatre organisation, I'm running that. I do feel a discourse personally of when I'm okay, what does it mean to be me as an artist, as a director, as a person who loves telling stories, who has the privilege and the opportunity to do that as me, and what is my political opinion of the world? And then what does it mean to be an artistic director of an institution of many, which may have wrangling different thoughts and different opinions? And how I personally evolve and change all the time in the context of my own life and in understanding the world and deepening my understanding, in trying to, find more stories and connections and build more nuance in my personal life. So for me to have one opinion that exists forever doesn't feel right or true to me, and therefore, I guess, in the response to being an artistic director of an organisation, there is truth there too. But I do think there isn't a simple answer. When I really pull out and zoom above my head and I go, actually the world is moving at such a rapid rate. There are these huge threats that are happening all the time. We can't ignore, and we can't say, and this is a binary perspective of how we, don't do or don't say stuff. It is such a discourse, and I'm really sorry because obviously I'm not expecting to, define what this is, but I do grapple with it, as a person who is in that camp. But I think at Payne's Power we always come back to what is our responsibility, what are the stories, what do we do as an organisation, and how do we reflect that in the work, in the writers that we produce, in what we programme in the roundabout, in the conversations that we have with a national programme of writers. We're very writer-led, so it always starts with the writer and what they want to say and how we're supporting that. And then when we come out of that, where it's around statements, I guess we do kind of what you say, we sort of go, you can't ignore, you don't want to ignore, but it's complex. And that's the point of this conversation. And that's why I was genuinely so excited to be part of this as the start of something, because I don't think there's an easy solution, and I don't think there's a definition of how arts organisations should carry on with this thread of thinking.
Devyani, you're publishing a book lately, you sort of referenced it so far, which is about the challenges that black, global majority and potentially marginalised leaders face when they work in institutions. And I suppose it's about that balance between how you hold practice as an artist and running an institution or a company. How central do you think this challenge is into that mix?
In terms of protest and the challenge of...
and how we've seen turnover of leadership as well.
Again, I think it ties a little bit to the beginning. The first answer in the sense of, I think sometimes since 2020, there's been a wave of hires, and in this book I interview arts leaders from mostly North America and increasingly here as well, of people who are kind of, here's the bag of where these culture palaces that were founded 40 years earlier, here it is, there's a lot of brokenness in it. I'm thinking of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival among other spaces, and now there's this incredible leader of color or who needs to clean it up. I'm thinking specifically in terms of kind of black women in many cases, and that having to then deal with protest or fallout or geopolitical situation without necessarily having the back kind of support for it does lead to that exiting. And the book is called Exiting, and there's a very famous schematic of people of color being invited into institutions and the move from pet to threat and then the exit at the door. So I think it is very key to it. I think any hot situation where someone is being put forward as, and I'm not speaking about myself, I'm speaking about leaders in other organizations, put forward as the fixer, and then also the fixer who has to hold the bag has led to basically a lot of retrenchment in some, I hope I'm making sense in this. This is specifically some key North American references, but so I'm curious to what actually the new models of leadership, like co-leadership and lattice works between people where one person isn't being held with that responsibility, look like. The fact you are one day a week and you maintain your freelance status, but you have association. So I think it's in structural change for leaders that we can help start to find solutions for how not to have fallout such as protest or other issues lead to people, individuals breaking, and therefore kind of a retrenchment of organizational ethics.
I want to open up to some audience questions in a second, so I'm going to skip some of the questions that I've got here, but I just want to ask with a sort of 20, 30-second answers. I know you've all thought about this, but in the conversations we've had around preparing for this panel, we've talked a lot about restrictions around freedom of expression. From all your preparation, if you were running an arts organisation, and not necessarily the one that you currently work for, what restrictions on artistic freedom would you be willing to inscribe as policy? And how do you think institutions could work with artists to best instill that practice? Nina.
I don't think there should be any restrictions on artistic freedom of expression in policy. I think that you're going to write a policy and then it's going to become immediately outdated because there will be a really compelling reason to change it. That being said, I think that it's the responsibility of the institution, even if it's not a one-size-fits-all policy, to know what it is they're trying to do and to know how to handle work that comes in that is difficult or provocative, and how to say no to work. But I would not put in policy any curbs on artistic freedom of expression.
I would also not put policy in that restricts artistic freedom of expression, but as I said, even in the work I'm in right now, there's a strong ethical framework. It has to be a living document. We've recently been in conversations about adding a human rights clause to that based on feedback from communities who felt they needed that in place. So once again, I think we have to be artist-led. The work has to exist. It has to exist within an ethical framework that is a living document and amended as such.
Katie.
Agree. I would not restrict an artist and what they want to say. I think it's just about building the framework in order to support and challenge and find the rigour of what the artist is wanting to, find within the context of the work, and never censoring that. I have no interest in that. I spoke to someone earlier and they said, we're at a point where when we look at a sort of linear structure of story, it's always like following this hero's journey. And actually, where was the seed change in that? And actually, that hero story is about, who's the villain, who's the hero, and what does that mean? And have we lost the opportunity to, dilute that and discover? And I guess, for me, it's always going. That's the detail and the nuance and the support. And the only thing I would come back to is where a writer would be at perceived risk and wanting to, support them and put anything in place for them to be able to do the work they wanted to do and tell the stories they want to tell.
Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm a libertarian. Of course, I'm going to say total freedom to do what you want to do. My first conscious thought around that is actually understanding the heart of the writer, the intent of the writer, and obviously it's got to be good, because if you give that freedom, you have to support it, and you have to put your own rep on the line, I guess. So I think some people have a very clever artifice of actually cajoling, particularly people into the belief of who they are. And I'd like to get to the heart of it, and I agree totally here, the responsibility should be their safety. I think you're right. But I think it's the intent of that person, and therefore you need to build trust and understanding for all that to happen. So I think it's some invisible parameters I would like to understand before I would give that freedom.
And Lilli?
I would agree with the first three. I wouldn't put any explicit policy around restrictions, but I would have a visible ethical framework, because I do think transparency and openness is absolutely crucial to building that trust and empathy. I was just reflecting on Devyani's point around leadership changes, and I was thinking about, again, this sort of, if we go back a few decades, what's changed there, and perhaps I'm being terribly crass in generalizing here, but I think as we kind of go into a post-truth, post-ideological space, we have less strong, ideologically driven leaders standing at the top, owning that judgment. And so we have perhaps the writers coming to them less sure of, and there's a greater openness of who might come through the door. And with that, you need more nuance and more frameworks to be able to hold a space to have a wider variety of plays and conversations and stories. So I was just thinking of actually there might be some sort of silver linings around the changes in leadership and a greater openness, but it is more complicated to then follow through and serve the work, serve the audience, serve the artists.
Fantastic. We've got 10 minutes to take some questions, but we are all going to be in the bar afterwards, and we'll give you an email address in which you can send some thoughts and further things through. We're going to take questions in groups of 3, so there's a roaming microphone around, and I think Will down in, we'll do 3 from the stalls, and then we'll do 3 in the circle. So, yes. I'll take 3, so I'll write your questions down, yes?
Sure. Hi. I'm not sure if this is necessarily a question. Just thank you so much for your time and everything you said. In Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck talks about how the men who came to take away the land from the farmers, they hid behind the banks, and as if that they were monsters. But as was pointed out to them, the banks are not monsters, they're made of men. And I think the same thing is true of these right-wing institutions, these mainstream media. They're all made of men. And the reason why the right are always winning is because they're willing to unite behind each other. And I think that speaking as an artist, as a performer, that's what we need from our institutions, right? This book I'm reading at the moment by Ruth Prava-Javela, she says that, she's talking about, doesn't matter, she says, these people have spent too long as victims to understand that they can act against an aggressor. And the idea is that I think that if we, as a community, were to come together and be supported by institutions, we can push back against a lot of this. Because artists need that. Because this work is still happening. In the margins, in the little black box pub theatres and stuff that I go to, there is so much fierce, powerful work being made. Not sort of toothless, circle-jerky stuff, but actually like really critical, powerful, important work. And it needs to be seen. It needs to be seen and it needs to be supported. So yeah, I don't know. I just felt that I had to say something. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Question? Could you pass this now to
Hi, this is for Playwrights. I'm curious how you approach addressing personal, socio, and political ideology, the content versus form, I guess, without getting pedantic, didactic, or Brechtian, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Next
that's my question.
Yeah. We're going to cluster them together and I'll ask them. So through.
Just pass it down the road. Just one past. Yeah, thank you.
Hiya. So my question was, I think the biggest example of what we've been discussing today was Steph O'Driscoll's adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream, of that being cancelled at the Royal Exchange. So my question was, what is your opinion of that? And if you were the theatre putting that on, would you have done anything differently just to safeguard, protect, or just what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah.
Thank
Should we take one more question?
Could we take one more from the circle while I get this microphone back?
Okay, one from the circle. Just grab one there.
I have a question about theatre's responsibility for political situation. I'm just going to say it, Palestine. I feel like no one said it all night, all day. Theatre's responsibility for Palestine offstage. We've spoken a lot about content, but in 2020, in the midst of the COVID crisis, we had Rufus Norris showing Rishi Sunak around the National Theatre. We had James Graham on BBC, what felt like daily, talking about why it was so important to invest in theatre. When Russia decided to invade Ukraine, we had the National Theatre in blue and yellow. All manner of other theatres lit up in the same colours. And I guess this question of just like, if theatre can clearly do something, why isn't it doing something now?
Should we take one more from the circle and then we'll go to the panel? One more in the circle. Anyone else up there? Yeah.
It's a very quick question. I wondered if anyone in the panel also feels that part of this issue, this discomfort we feel, comes from an inherent flaw in the British character.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect question to end on. So the first question I think we had there was around the Royal Exchange, which I don't know the falls in and outs of, and whether we know the ins and outs of that. I suppose, as sort of artists on the panel, when we're dealing with like political work where there's clearly a political conflict with sort of the artistic leaders of organisations, how better can we hold those conversations? Like, what does that look like, and has that ever been an issue that the panel have come up against, or that we've had in our like professional lives?
I mean, I think that there's a responsibility of the building of the institution to know the artists that you're engaging with and know the work that they're making and be really, really present in that. I don't know and can't speak to the ins and outs of what happened there, but it felt from the outside like I could not understand how a piece of work could get that far down the line and then be surprising to a building. I think, you know, something has gone wrong in that pipeline, and you can be making the most apolitical work in the world and you should still know what's going on your stages. So you should never get that late in a process and suddenly be surprised.
Anyone else want to talk to that? I think, yes, agreed. In terms of Palestine, why are there some issues where it feels like we are more free to talk and issues where there does seem to be more of a perceived silence? Does anyone have a view on this and where that difficulty comes from?
You're so right to raise it, and it's just it's been so difficult to watch or listen to the silence, but also to have conversations in and around. I think it's been confusingly difficult at times. I've read some amazing pieces that kind of delve into this, and I can't think straight under the lights to summarise them. I don't think I have any particular expertise or kind of opinion to sort of really add here. I just, it continues to be disappointing. I guess, there's a lot of complexity there, but I share that disappointment.
It is to hear say that if I can't think straight when we're talking about a genocide, like we're here at a discussion and he's talking about political issues and censorship, and he also oblivious to the self-censorship going on here in terms of actually talking about politics in broad terms, but not being able to specifically talk about what those political issues are. David, you spoke about reputational risk. We know that reputational risk is specific about Palestine. We've had a whole conversation, 45 minutes of listening to a panel, but we haven't heard the word Palestine at all. And we know that reputational risk to do with theatres is specifically to do with Palestine, because there was an FOI request from our union equity that demonstrated and proved that. And you speak, David, about the fact, right, that you wanted to do an event like this for a whole year. So why haven't you? What has stopped you? You're an artistic director. Why haven't you afforded space for this conversation sooner? Because right now it feels like what a lot of institutions are trying to do is reputational recovery, right? Because you've been silent for 15 months. And I know it's been said that, theatres shouldn't necessarily be compelled to have to put out statements out there. I'm sorry, as a minority, it's important for me to know what a theatre thinks about something politically, because I want to know if my morals align with yours, especially as somebody who is from a marginalised community. And insane institutions shouldn't be expected to make statements, but the fact is they do about absolutely everything, unless it is something that will cause reputational risk. So I have to say, I've sat here and I've engaged and I've listened, but I'm thoroughly disappointed, as are so many of us, about how people have been skirting around the issue and cannot even say genocide, Gaza, Palestine. It's embarrassing.
Can I ask, have you been to Gaza? Can I ask, have you been to Gaza?
Before we...
Sorry, David, you took some critique there. Have you been to Gaza? I have. Hang on a minute. Before you all leap in, shush. Before you leap in to attack me, I have been supporting for 7 or 8 years a non-political charity within Gaza. I've been to Gaza, I've been to the West Bank. I find it very distressing. I find it very, very distressing that the lessons of history are still not learned. I've been supporting a filmmaker who made a remarkable film who can't get it distributed at the moment. So I have my own feelings about it, and it's incredibly complicated. for all the things we're saying. Okay. I know it's not about me. I'm not about me. I'm trying to defend David, who's been very brave to try and create something here, which is an open debate. And it's polarised. Okay.
To address the point directly, I mean, I think Gaza and Palestine is one of the big issues that is surrounding like the political debate. But just to give you a context, actually, it's not one of the only things like as an institution we're facing at the moment. I would say in the last month or two, we've had a lot of conversations and pressure around Gaza and Israel from both sides of that conversation around where our political allegiance as an organisation is. I mean, over the last year, I'm sure you'll be aware, but we've had boycott speeches here at the court. We've had artistic directors from Palestine over onto our stages to talk. The show that we've got in coming downstairs next is a Palestinian artist who's coming to talk about Gaza. We've had a lot of conversations. But what's been interesting as an artistic director is there is a lot of pressure around those conversations and a lot of pressure from different groups to either push the institution towards having more of a political view one way or the other, or to hijack the theatre for people's own politics. And I'm really interested in where, as an artistic institution, we sit on that. We also have had, in the last sort of month or two, extreme right-wing parties in the UK, particularly around a show we did at the end of the year towards about the grooming scandals, really target artists on our stage. And we had a sort of huge online pylon. It had roughly 500,000 sort of engagements from sort of far-right parties. We're also just about to undertake a production where it's very critical of an international regime where there is quite intense, internationally reaching censorship laws. And I think Gaza absolutely has been the real nexus point of the last 2 years of where there has been a perceived silence from institutions, where some organisations have not gone near the subject and not wanted to touch anything which even talks around issues to do with Israel or issues to do with Palestine. But actually, I think there are multiple fronts on which institutions are being attacked, where institutions are being pushed and pulled. I suppose as an artistic director, this conversation isn't solely about that, although I think that is very much the context we're having now. But I suppose as I look forward to the next 10 years, we've got to work out where we sit on how we hold these conversations and these arguments. I totally understand that people are angry and frustrated. I'm angry and frustrated. You sit there and you run these jobs as artists and try and work out, well, how best do I hold and balance our responsibilities as institutional leaders who are figureheads who are holding the views of sometimes hundreds of people who work beneath you and wider stakeholders for whom your existence relies upon, but also our own views and politics as individual artists, as playwrights and as citizens in the world. And it feels like our role as national institutions, those post-war values that held us very well up until the last decade or so, are completely falling apart. And nobody knows quite what to do going forward. And that's what I think this conversation is opening and is about. It's not necessarily about skirting around the issues, but it's about the politics of politics. It's about how do we reinvent these institutions to be able to hold a lot more of that discourse and dialogue. And I totally understand our frustration on the individual. I don't think this is about winning or sort of story, but that's, I suppose, the position I'm coming from. And I totally understand your passion on Palestine and where that sits. But I suppose for me, the conversation sits in a slightly different place. And it absolutely encompasses all of that and all of that anger and all of that frustration and the times you feel just like screaming because the world we're living in is not the world we see represented in the institutions that should fundamentally be representing us as a society and a people. I suppose I'm trying to work out how we get to a point where that feels less the case. Or how I suppose we move some of that dissonance and some of that conflict into the institutions themselves. And how actually we hold that tension more. Because at the moment it feels like we're not doing either. It feels like we're neither having a conversation and we're not stepping up and going, well, okay, let's talk about how we could do it better. And we're not acknowledging the sort of conflict that's going on in the world, that is going on outside our doors every single day, that is having protests sort of through the city every single week. And it's how I suppose, well, genocides throughout the world. Conflicts in our society where there are no easy answers and we're all feeling frustrated with each other. And I suppose that's where this came from. So apologies if the conversation has frustrated, but actually I think the conversation, including this part of it, is incredibly useful. And actually without it, we're not going to be able to move forward. I realise we're almost out of time.
Statement that the global majority led theatres, only 3 theatres did that. Global majority led. What does that tell you?
Yeah. We have to wrap up, but we do have a bar downstairs in which we will all be present to continue and talk more. There's clearly a lot of views on this, and I think we should delve into them. I'd like to invite John Studinsky, who has funded this panel, to summarise and sum up the conversation we had.
Could I just say thank you all for coming today. Let me applaud the Royal Court Theatre for beginning this discussion, for demonstrating leadership on this issue. This is long overdue in London, long overdue in the world. And as someone who's deeply committed to human rights and human dignity, I'm really glad to hear this broad discussion. I'm particularly glad for this open, robust intervention. Thank you for that. And what this makes me think about, though, is 2 or 3 things. One, we're living in a society, and I'm glad this is the first of many discussions, but I think we're now living in a world where people have to rethink how they listen to each other, because we all listen with the view that we're going to, how we're going to respond. We listen on how we're going to respond. We don't listen to how we're going to understand. And so much of what the problems I see in the world, and this is where the theater is important, to be able to write in a way that we can demonstrate empathy. And when I think of what has happened in terms of discourse, when you're teaching young children to debate, one of the great vehicles is you have them take the same issue and you have them debate one side, then the other, and then you have them reverse roles. So, and in that exercise, they have a greater sense of understanding and empathy, and then they learn to listen. So I'm delighted we've had such a robust panel tonight. I think this is the first of many discussions. It is what the theater should be about, to deal with important issues and to show leadership. And it's very important that the audience be engaged in a very active way, because I think that is the essence. The creative industries is about making people feel uncomfortable. And when I think about how many stories are told in history, and sometimes it takes decades for those stories to be told. And what we're now being challenged with is the need to tell those stories on a real-time basis, and to debate, and to listen, and to have a greater sense of empathy. So thank you for this discussion, and thank you all for your engagement. And it's very, very, very important to show this kind of leadership. Thank you.